Kia ora, my name's Gareth.
And I'm Roger.
And together we're...
Roger and Gareth.
My name's Gareth.
And I'm Roger.
Oh, and we're getting feedback. Oh gosh, this is live, isn't it? This is completely live.
We're getting feedback. Oh gosh, this is live, isn't it? This is...
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah.
So welcome to Walk Tours NZ, and this is a virtual walk tour of Rainbow LGBTI history from Wellington. And this is quite a special tour today because this is the first time we have done a virtual tour of the Red Tour, which is around the kind of Vivian Street, Cuba Street area. So we're quite excited today to be able to share it with you. We are seeing the feed, as you would have heard before, from YouTube. So if you are watching on YouTube, please feel free to put some comments in the chat if you've got a question, or if you want to say hi. It'd be lovely to be able to say hi back to you. So that's all good. And we should also say thank you to begin with, Rog.
Yes, to Alison Laurie and Hugh Young for their research, some of which this tour is based on.
Fantastic.
Well, we are virtually at Pukayahu Park in Wellington, and virtually standing on the steps of the National War Memorial. The Krillian bell tower was dedicated on Anzac Day 1932 with huge crowds in attendance, as you can see hopefully from an image we're just about to show. There we go, there's the Krillian itself, and if you go down a wee bit you can see the huge crowd.
Which is coming, it's coming. This is an amazing crowd, so all those little dots are people everywhere.
So Pukayahu National War Memorial Park itself was completed for Anzac Day 2015, and it commemorates the 30,000 New Zealanders who've died and more than 300,000 who have served New Zealand in various conflicts around the world. Of those who came back, many came back wounded or terribly scarred, and this brings us to Harold Gillies, who's not only pioneered plastic surgery, but also pioneered gender reassignment surgery.
So Harold was born in Dunedin in 1882, and in the early 1900s he went to England to learn medicine. So he enlisted in World War I and was sent to France. And there he saw some horrific injuries. A lot of injuries were caused by shrapnel, so tiny bits of metal that were encased in shells, they would explode and then they would pepper soldiers with the shrapnel. And it would do horrific things like really take limbs off, really disfigure people. And so he and a group of other people decided to set up a field hospital that was specifically looking at facial and body reconstruction. So the Battle of the Somme, they saw 2,000 patients go through that particular hospital, and it was described as, quote, a stream of wounded men with half their faces literally blown to pieces, with the skin left hanging in shreds and jawbones crushed to a pulp. Harold and the team really developed some really amazing ways of working with what they had, and they were developing skin grafting techniques and also bone replacement techniques, so like taking a bit of bone or cartilage from a rib and putting it into the face. By the end of World War I, Harold and his team had done over 11,000 operations in terms of facial reconstruction. And then after the war, he started thinking about, after seeing how the soldiers responded to that treatment and the psychological benefit it had, he started investigating the idea of gender affirming surgery. And so Harold was one of the first people to undertake gender affirming surgery. In 1946, he and a colleague did one of the first gender reassignments from female to male, and then 5 years later from male to female. And so it's great to be able to remember Harold on this tour.
Well, significant commemorations happened on the steps that we are virtually standing on, the steps of the War Memorial, in the mid-1980s. In May 1985, Jeff Clements and Bill Logan were trying to have the persecution of lesbian and gay men recognised during the 40th anniversary of the end of the Holocaust. And these commemorations were to be held at the Michael Fowler Centre. Now, at the very same time, rainbow communities were also protesting the inclusion at that event of the Salvation Army, who've been very vocal in their opposition to homosexual law reform, and the exclusion of rainbow communities from that same event. So Bill Logan and Alison Laurie tried to organise an event here at the Hall of Memories, which is underneath the Krillian. That too was denied, and so people gathered here on the steps on the evening of the 6th of May 1985. There were people like Bill and Alison, Prue Hyman and the writer Tom McLean, who described vividly the scene. Around us, just outside the circle created by our portable lights, I could see them gathering, the bundles of bone, clad in lice-ridden rags, bald, reduced to a number tattooed on their wrists, and there was nothing to fear. They looked up at what was an all too familiar sight in a strange surrounding, a large cloth pink triangle illuminated from behind. It was the badge they had to wear in the camps to identify themselves as homosexuals. As the atmosphere deepened, so came the spirits of the women, lesbians who in the camps had been denied even a label identifying why they'd been rounded up and imprisoned. For many, the average life expectancy in the camps was about half an hour, from the cattle trucks to the changing rooms, from the gas chambers to the ovens. Last of all came the men and women who'd borne the brunt of the Nazi hunt for a surgical cure for homosexuality and lesbianism. So we huddled together, the living and the dead, and we saw the miracle, a survivor, someone who'd been through the hell that was Auschwitz and Mauthausen and come out alive. Now that person that Tom McLean was talking about was the survivor, Dr. Edith Egger, and she was brought to New Zealand to be a guest speaker at the commemoration in the Michael Fowler Centre, but she also attended this event. She'd been found on the top of a pile of rotting corpses in a concentration camp weighing only 27 kilograms. Well, 10 years later, in 1995, lesbians, gay men and disabled people were specifically invited to the 50th anniversary commemoration.
And we should just point out, so the doctor is just sitting down, so we've got Prue Hyman and Bill Logan standing up. Prue's just by the triangle in that image, and then Dr. Egger is just one of the people sitting down by the wall.
She's still alive. She's well in her 90s now, but she's still going.
Yep. We're going to our next stop now, which is literally just over the road, and before we do, I'll just say hi to all those that are watching. It's great that we can see the numbers watching. 3, which is better than 2, which is better than just us. Yep, there you go. And so what we're going to do is I will just turn this off and interact with Google. So we're just spinning around and we're going to this building here, and this building is in fact one of the locations for Te Papa, our national museum, and this building is very much used as a storage facility but also a research facility, and holds a vast range of specimens and objects in taonga in the national collections. So Te Papa holds a lot of rainbow-related taonga. So we've got the New Zealand AIDS Memorial Quilt. We've got quite a lot of taonga from Carmen Rupe. We've got Chrissy Wituku's Evergreen panels, which we'll talk about a bit later. And then we've also got these other items. I'll just bring up this again. This one here.
So there we go. So this coming up.
I keep going.
An image of a softball player's shirt. It's a shirt from, there we go, thank you, from the Amazons, which was the first lesbian softball club in New Zealand. They formed in Wellington at the height of gay liberation in 1977. Now, the club provided an important opportunity for self-identified lesbians to socialise, find solidarity and develop confidence in their sporting abilities. And the name comes from the mythological Greek all-female warriors. It wasn't easy for the Amazons in the beginning, with some of the other women's teams refusing to play against them, but over time they became accepted, and indeed they became accepted as a force to be reckoned with. And the high point of the Amazons' career was when they're promoted to the major reserve during the 1988-89 season.
So there are at least 2 Brians relating to rainbow communities held within Te Papa, and this is a question for our viewers at the moment. Does anyone know who those 2 Brians might be?
Can you name these Brians?
You can just put them into the chat, and we'll give it a few seconds just to see how it's looking. Of course, there's around about a 3-4 second delay between us live and what goes on YouTube, so we'll just, I think this is called padding for time, and nothing's coming up. So the 2 Brians are, we have Brian Tamaki, and who is now Apostle Brian Tamaki. His polyester suit that he wore at the Enough is Enough rally for civil union, against civil unions in 2004 is in Te Papa. That was a huge rally on the steps of Parliament. A lot of Destiny Church members were there. They were rallying against a whole lot of things, and one of those things that really drew people together was the Civil Unions Bill, which actually did pass in the end. But he did donate his polyester suit to Te Papa, which was really fantastic.
Good of him, yeah.
And the other Brian is a very famous person here. This is Brian Brake, and Brian Brake is one of New Zealand's most significant and well-known photographers. He was born in Wellington in 1927, and he studied with Spencer Digby in 1945, and then he moved on to doing film work for the National Film Unit. And here's a lovely photo of Brian, I think that with the Southern Alps in the background. Brian, in fact, here's a fun fact, Brian was the first New Zealander to be nominated for an Academy Award in 1959. So Brian soon went overseas and really developed his photojournalism skills. He really took a lot of photos around Asia, was in China in the 1950s and 60s, which was quite unusual for Western people to be there and to have such amazing access. But he also went and did a lot of photography that is really well known now. This is an image, one of his better known images from the Monsoon series, and it's quite stunning. So Brian kept all of his copyright throughout his entire life. He worked for the Magnum Photo Agency, which is a kind of a body of professional photojournalists, but he kept his copyright, and he kept all his own negatives and transparencies. And before his death, I think or maybe it was after his death, these were donated to Te Papa, and so Te Papa now holds 118,000 individual images from Brian Brake, which is extraordinary.
Well, Te Papa also has items relating to Frankie Lund and Johnny Croskery, and here's an image of them both. They performed together as female impersonators in the cabaret act Frankie and Johnny at Carmen's Balcony strip club on Victoria Street in the 1970s. In a 2004 interview, Frankie explained that his family was very supportive of his drag performance and often joined in. Now, Frankie made most of his own outfits and had an extensive selection of beads and buttons and sequins and feathers and various other trimmings and costume jewellery. And Te Papa has one of his garments, which you can see now.
Well, a number, actually.
A number of his garments.
Yeah.
Frankie's drag persona was Tony Roger, on the right of this image here, and on the left is Johnny. Now, Johnny began his working life in the late 1950s as a window dresser for the DIC department store in Wellington. Johnny was active as a performer from the early 1960s, but he also worked quietly and tirelessly as a volunteer with HIV/AIDS communities in Wellington. He did one-on-one support, but he could also be regularly seen collecting donations on World AIDS Day in the Manners Mall and Lambton Quay area, and often he farewelled people with his trademark line, "Have a gay day."
Lovely, lovely.
He was also an early campaigner for homosexual law reform and human rights. And shortly we'll be looking at the site of Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, where he also performed.
Before we get to Carmen's, our next stop is actually just a bit further down Tory Street. That's behind us here now, and we're actually just going to Google view down as well, so you get a sense of how far it is. So this is us walking at a bit of a clip
down to the corner of Tory and Vivian Streets.
Coming up.
Nearly there. Past the warehouse on the right. Keep going down to the corner. There we go. Coming up.
Okay. And so we're just heading, if we kept heading down this road, we would go to the waterfront. But the building we're actually looking at is the one actually behind us on the back wall here. This is the Lesbian Club, and it's actually on the left-hand side of the Google image here as well. And this was Wellington's first lesbian club, called Club 41, and the reason it was called Club 41 was because the actual street address is 41 Vivian Street. So 4 women purchased the site from Carmen Rupe, who had another establishment called the Peacock here, and each of the 4 women put in $1,000, and one of those was Pauline Simmons, who we'll talk about in a minute. But actually we've got an image of an advert for the club, and we can see here it says, "I couldn't cope in the straight world to save my life," and then at the bottom of the advert it's as if I've taken off a mask, having such a wonderful time. And so this was an advert that was produced and put into a magazine called Circle magazine, which Pauline Simmons actually printed with her story press, and the actual front of the Circle is on the right hand side there. But there were some interesting things about the liquor licensing, wasn't there?
See, scrolling down here.
Let me tell you about liquor licensing. Yes. So at the time, the liquor licenses in New Zealand were pretty tight, so clubs couldn't actually sell liquor. But to get around those issues, basically the clubs would sell tickets or tokens to get into the club, and then you would exchange those tokens for liquor, and that's how they kind of circumvented that kind of legislation. It wasn't only Club 41 that had that issue. Quite a number of other clubs had issues like that. The Dorian Society, for instance, had similar issues.
Yeah. Well, moving on now to our next stop.
Yes.
Which is a little bit
our next stop is actually just a little bit further down Vivian Street, and what we're going to do is we can I'll just move this across and Rog can start talking about Carmen's.
Right, yes, so we're looking at the site of Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, which was next to the Salvation Army citadel there at the time. Yes, it's the sort of greyish building there directly behind us that you can see. Now, Carmen was a performer as well as an activist, particularly around anti-discrimination and HIV/AIDS causes. She was an entrepreneur, and her businesses included the Balcony nightclub, the Egyptian tea room in Cuba Street, a curio shop also in Cuba Street, a massage parlour, and a brothel in a big old house in Hataitai. Now, Carmen was born in 1936 in the central North Island before she relocated to Auckland and then to Wellington. She moved to Sydney's King's Cross in the late 1950s and became Australia's first Maori drag performer, and from that time lived her life as a woman, self-identifying as transsexual. From 1967 she returned to Wellington and saw this clothing factory with 4-bedroom flat in the upper floor and magically turned it into her international coffee lounge. So when I say this, it's the little image that you can see just across there.
Everything's mirrored.
There we go. There.
Oh dear. Yep.
It's coffee lounge. So its interior was as opulent as the outside. It had velvet curtains, feathers, and ornaments everywhere.
And of course, the really quite interesting thing with this is that Carmen actually rented this location from the Salvation Army, which is quite funny. And the Salvation Army is actually just to the left of it. So, like if Roger was to move his head, we would see that the Citadel, the Salvation Army Citadel, is right there. So they were what should we call strange bedfellows, weren't they?
Well, to coin a phrase, yeah. Going to tell us about
yes, but it was interesting because Carmen not only had the coffee lounge on the ground floor, but on the first floor was a brothel, and so the way that the clients identified what kind of liaison they wanted was with teacups and saucers, and so they would come in, they'd have their cup of tea. If they put the cup on the saucer facing down, it was for a heterosexual liaison, a cup on its side was for a transgender liaison, and a saucer on top of a cup was for a homosexual liaison. And so Carmen would spot this. She would send the sex worker, there was a kind of a back staircase that they went up and went to the rooms upstairs, and then the client would come outside and walk up a separate staircase outside of the building. And they had a whole range of different rooms upstairs. For instance, there was an Egyptian themed room. Apparently there was also a coffin with a skeleton in it at the top of the stairs. Carmen was very much into kind of witchcraft and things like that. So it was a really kind of eclectic good time, I guess.
Something for everyone.
Yes.
And apparently Carmen had a great line for male patrons.
Yes, yes. She said, Roger, if particularly if somebody was giving them a bit of annoyance, she would say to them, "Do you want a fuck or a fight? Because I can give you both," which is very nice.
Great line to have. So this business relocated further up Wigan Street, and we'll go to there in a moment. And so we'll move to our next site in a moment. But first of all, let's talk about the Salvation Army, and they feature quite a little bit in this tour. It's March 1985, and MP Fran Wild has just introduced the Homosexual Law Reform Bill into Parliament. Now, Fran's bill set out to decriminalise homosexual activity between consenting adult males and make it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on their sexual orientation. But within a week of introducing the bill to Parliament, there was a nationwide anti-law reform petition launched by 4 MPs. It was taken up by Peter Tate and the builder Keith Hay, and at the time Hay was quoted in the media as saying, "I'm just a carpenter doing God's work." Well, shortly after that, the Salvation Army agreed to be the petition coordinator, and they could use its extensive network to circulate the petition far and wide. And in a letter to Salvationists, Colonel Campbell from the Salvation Army wrote that many Christians and God-fearing people have embarked upon the gigantic task of endeavouring to secure a minimum of 1 million signatures on a petition to Parliament to prevent the passage of the bill. The Colonel's view was that the moral decay of civilization is proceeding unchecked, and that it is in many ways a greater threat than that of nuclear destruction. It's pretty bad, really. Very quickly, the anti-law reform petition was circulating nationwide, and it was being taken from one house to the next and passed around workplaces and even schools. So pro-reform campaigners got angry, and they protested at the Salvation Army citadels throughout the country on the 31st of March. And they had various chants at the time. Things like 2, 4, 6, 8, gay is twice as good as straight. Or door-to-door petition, door-to-door collection pays for door-to-door petition. And also the well-known hymn, Yes, Jesus Was Gay. So there were activists right in the faces of Salvationists, but also there were those taking other actions.
And two of those were B. Arthur and Betty Armstrong, and here's a lovely photo of B and Betty. They were driving up and down Vivian Street on the day, and they were honking the horn in support of law reform, and then they'd go around and do the same thing again. So Betty and B had been together since 1943, and years ago Alison Laurie interviewed B, and B was saying at the time in the 1940s they didn't call it lesbianism, they didn't have a word for it. B says, quote, "It didn't have a name, we didn't seem to feel the need to be called anything, we just were, it didn't seem to matter." Well, they have an incredibly long relationship, and when Betty died in 2000, B established the Arthur and Armstrong Charitable Trust for Lesbians, which still operates here in Wellington, and it really supports a lot of causes here in Wellington. And the trust was named to commemorate their 57-year their 57-year relationship, which is again really remarkable. Yeah. So B also died in 2002, and they're both buried together at Waikanai Cemetery.
Well, briefly back to the anti-reform petition. When it was presented at Parliament, the organisers claimed 800,000 signatures. But this was later discounted because there were lots of repeat signatures and forgeries. So, should we move to the next site, which is just opposite Carmen's new International Coffee Lounge, a bit further up Vivian Street.
So we're just crossing Taranaki Street now. Vivian Street. You can see it's a lovely day in Wellington, which is lovely. And the building we're actually looking at is the green high-rise building coming up on your right, just where the subway sign is.
Yeah, so this part of Vivian has seen a number of significant Rainbow establishments. It was the second home of Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, which moved there in 1979. Now, Carmen actually left Wellington soon after that, and she lived for the rest of her life in Australia. But in 1984, Chrissy Witoko took over ownership of the site and opened the Evergreen Cafe there. Chrissy's priority was always to ensure a gay and trans-friendly social environment, and it was a home away from home for many Rainbow communities. It was famous for its late-night toasted sandwiches. Chrissy's warmth and remarkable ability to bring together people from very different backgrounds. Between 1986 and 1987, the Evergreen was an official gay and lesbian community drop-in centre, and it was run by volunteers and offered support and counselling along with coffee and cake. After 11 p.m. it became a drop-in centre for sex workers. Now, Chrissy also operated the late-night coffee bar, The Nutcracker, which was located just a wee bit further up Vivian Street to where the hole in the wall is now. Following Chrissy's death in 2002, a group of her friends formed a trust to fundraise to help pay for funeral costs for those community members who weren't able to cover the costs. And in 2012, Te Papa, the National Museum, acquired a set of 34 large collage panels created by Chrissy. Now, these used to hang on the walls of the Evergreen, and each collage features Chrissy's friends, family and acquaintances, and they spanned from the 1960s through to 2002. Now, they're a really important visual record of the people, places and major events that were entwined with Rainbow life in New Zealand. And all of the collages, in fact, can be viewed on the Te Papa website, and you can zoom right in and see the detail. For example, here are Tony, aka Frankie Lund, and Johnny, who we talked about just a wee bit earlier.
Well, immediately next door to that is actually where the Purple Onion used to be located, and just coming up to a shot here of the Purple Onion. And so the Purple Onion was established by Pasi Tunapopo in 1964, and it was based on the Purple Onion in Sydney. So Pasi, who was the first Samoan drag performer to perform at Les Girls in Sydney, came back to New Zealand and established the Purple Onion here. And it was Wellington's first drag female impersonator club from the mid-1960s. It soon developed into a striptease club, but at the time striptease was limited to the furthest you could go down was having nipple pasties on and a G-string. So that was the furthest you could go. And actually there was a vice squad in Wellington, a police vice squad, that would go in and enforce those kind of things. Carmen got her first job in the adult entertainment industry in Wellington at the Purple Onion. So that's quite a nice tie-in as well. There's also a lovely photo here from 1965, and this is from the Salient magazine, and it is showing the all-male review that was on at the time, and the Salient magazine was it Victoria University's student magazine. Yeah.
Well, let's move on now just around the block to the next site, which is on Wigan Street.
And to be honest, I'm not going to use Google Street View to get round there because it is a bit of a tricky street, but just to point out that basically you cut through Dunlop Street here. Running parallel to Vivian is Wigan Street, and at Wigan Street we have a interesting, let me just find it for you. No, well, we are coming back to that. Oh gosh, it's all going to custard, isn't it? Custard. What we're looking at behind us is 22 Wigan Street. 22 Wigan Street, which is the site of the Lesbian Club in the mid-80s, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But just continuing on a wee bit more about female impersonation, a really long history here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We can go back to the Kiwi concert party in World War II. For instance, this is Bill Bain. Sorry, I'd forgotten Bill's last name. This is Bill Bain as Carmen Miranda, and it's a great shot. But also, there's another wonderful shot here of this is Ralph Dyer, and Ralph was performing here in New Caledonia, 1943, as Marlene Heatrash, and it's just a wonderful group of performers that were performing for troops and allied troops around the world. So the way that the Kiwi concert party was formed was that our General Freiberg was in Africa, and I think South Africa, and saw a performance and really got inspired and said we need a concert party troupe for New Zealand, and so the New Zealand Concert Party Troupe was created. They spent half of their time as kind of serving soldiers, so doing military actions like with guns, and then the other half they spent in performing, and they would perform as close to the front line as possible and really give a bit of a razzle dazzle to the troops. And you can see here with Marlene, you know, it is razzle and lots of dazzle as well. After the war, the Kiwi Concert Party toured New Zealand for at least 10 years. And Ralph here was performing in cabaret in Auckland for a number of years after that.
Well, we can go back even further than wartime to find examples of female impersonators in New Zealand. This image here, which is coming up, is of the performer and photographer Robert Gant. Now, Robert's on the right there. Robert lives most of his life in Wellington and Wairarapa, but he has a career as a female impersonator and uses the stage name Cecil Riverton. Now, the Evening Post declared Cecil as achieving a pronounced success in the role of Little Buttercup in the 1881 production of HMS Pinafore. Now, Robert's life and photographs have been documented in Chris Brickell's 2012 book Manly Affections, and I would advise you to check that out if you want to find out more about Robert Gant and see his amazing photography from that time.
Well, the reason we're actually standing, or virtually standing, we're actually sitting in this location is 22 Wigan Street was a site of the Lesbian Club in the mid-80s. And this was really important for organising around homosexual law reform. So homosexual law reform was in 85 and 86, but the kind of activism had been going on for decades before that. But this was a centralised place for lesbian activity. One of the people that visited the Lesbian Club here was Audra Lord, and here's a photo of Audra. And Audra is regarded internationally as one of the most important writers of the black feminist movement. And one of her most famous quotes is this quote: "Those of us who stand outside the circle of the society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It's learning how to take our differences and make them strengths, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." Now, interestingly, during Jan Logie's maiden speech when she became a Member of Parliament, she revealed that she actually has an Audre Lorde quote tattoo, and the quote she has is, "My silences have not protected me," which is a very strong quote.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's nip back onto Vivian and around to Cuba Street now.
And so I'm just going to Google this, so my driving's not that good. Oh, I've gone the wrong way.
Wrong way up, one-way street, but never mind, it's only virtual, it's not for real. There we go. Yay. Onto Cuba Street now. And we're at the territorial headquarters, there we go, of the Salvation Army, which was opened in 1990 by Princess Anne. Today, the Army has 100 communities of faith throughout New Zealand, Fiji and Tonga. It's got around 500 officers and about 8,000 members. So the Army was very vocal against homosexual law reform, and the question I would put to you, viewers, is how do you think they went with civil unions?
Now, we are looking live at the chat in YouTube, so you're more than welcome to enter in your answer. As I say, we have a little delay, and we don't have any answers, Rog.
How do you think they did with civil unions in 2004? Well, the church was divided, and certainly a lot less publicly vocal in its opposition. That role was taken up by the Destiny Church. But the Salvation Army's submission to the Parliamentary Select Committee was that they accepted the arguments for the Relationships Act, which removed discrimination on the grounds of homosexual partners. But they urged upon Parliament the importance of supporting and valuing marriage as foundational to society. There was, however, a small Salvationist protest at Parliament, and the media reported that 6 representatives of the Army turned up outside Parliament with a banner reading, "Yeah, civil union, now I can marry my goat and have children." Well, they dragged along a live goat with them, and that caused swift criticism, rightly so, from animal rights activists at the time.
We should also point out, though, that the Salvation Army is a broad church, and just last year they came out in support of banning gay conversion therapy, and that's a huge movement forward for the Salvation Army. And so while we talk about what they've done in the past, we should also, I guess, acknowledge
what they're doing now, which is
Yep.
some pretty good work. So.
Yep. Well, the building behind us here is the People's Palace, and the People's Palace was a set of buildings. Well, the Salvation Army built a number of People's Palaces in Australia and in New Zealand, and this one on Cuba Street is the only surviving example of a People's Palace. So built in the late 1890s, early 1900s, it was really low-cost accommodation for travellers and families. On the same site, prior to this building, the Salvation Army had the Paulina Rescue Home, and if we had been there in 1895, we could well have come across a very young Eugene Fellaini, who I will just bring up an image of.
So this is an example of what we would today describe as a non-binary life. Born in Italy in 1875, Eugene came to New Zealand at the age of 2 with his family. He was the eldest of 22 children, so it was a huge family, 17 of whom survived. Eugene was working at Murphy's Brickworks in Taranaki Street when he was taken to court for impersonating a man. Around 1895 he ran away to sea, aged 21, and then Eugene was raped multiple times by the ship's captain and had a baby in Sydney in 1898. Now, staying in Sydney, he changed his name to Harry Crawford and married twice. He was charged and subsequently convicted of murdering one of those wives in 1920. Now, the evidence for the conviction was circumstantial, but by today's standards it looks far from compelling. Nevertheless, he was convicted and imprisoned. Eugene died in 1938 after being released from prison and stepping off the pavement and accidentally into the path of an oncoming car.
Well, another example of what we could say now is a non-binary life is that of Amy Bock. And here are a couple of photos of Amy. So Amy was born in Tasmania in Australia and came to New Zealand in 1884. And pretty much right from the start, Amy was picked up by the law for a variety of reasons, and mainly due to fraud. So buying goods without the ability to actually kind of pay for them. Oh, and we should just say, I'm not sure, we've had a comment. I don't understand that. Do you? I'm sorry. The Arctic. Okay, we might have to come back on that. Yes.
Thanks, anyway.
Yeah, but yes, Amy was really interesting. Run-ins with the law from the 1890s right through until about 1908, when Amy took on the identity of Percival Redwood, and Percival really wooed a rich farmer's daughter called Agnes Ottaway, and they subsequently married. And then about a day after the marriage, Agnes petitioned for a divorce, and Amy was subsequently charged with, in the terminology of the time, masquerading as a man, and was convicted and went to prison. So nowadays, some people have described Amy as a lesbian or a trans man. Author Fiona Farrell has put another idea forward. Fiona wrote, "Had Amy lived in Europe, she may well have come to the attention of psychologists who were studying a number of similar cases in which young working class women attempted to escape their proper roles as housemaids, cooks and governesses by disguise and petty fraud." I think this is just a really good example, and it's a bit like with Eugene as well, as like trying to, like when we look back and trying to put a lens of today on what people were back then is really hard. I mean, I think what we can say is that I think both Amy and Eugene had really tough lives, and a lot of that was due to kind of unaccepting society.
Well, yes, then, but also as today, people won't neatly fit into little shoeboxes. So, moving on to our
next stop. And we should just warn you that this next stop is talking about a local hate crime, and so it's a yeah.
Right.
Yeah, if you want to.
So I will start. We're just moving around to just around the corner from here. So early on the morning of the 8th of May 1999, 14-year-old Jeff Whittington was sitting on the curb of this petrol station, which we're about. There we go, there's the petrol station. He's had a night out, he's drunk and he's high. At 4:20 a.m, a police officer comes by and starts to talk to Jeff. Jeff says he's okay, and so the police officer leaves. But also out drinking that night are two men in their mid-20s, Stephen Smith and Jason Meads. Now, by chance, they drive by Jeff here, sitting at the petrol station. He's a complete stranger to them. They stop their car and start talking to Jeff, and then all three wind up a short drive away in Arrow Valley to smoke a joint. Now, it's here that Stephen and Jason beat Jeff to death. The pair later boasted to acquaintances that they'd beaten up a faggot who was wearing makeup. They told their acquaintances that they had never seen anyone bleed from the places that he bled from. Stephen and Jason admitted to punching and kicking him, but they denied stomping on his head and said that they never meant to kill him. Well, Jeff suffers severe brain damage, has boot marks on his skin and a ruptured bowel. A woman finds him alone the next day, lying alone in a puddle at 4:40 a.m, and he dies in hospital the next day. So a jury convicts both Stephen and Jason of murder, and they're sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, Jason was released in 2013, and Stephen was freed on parole in April 2017, but he'd been released on 3 previous occasions and recalled to prison each time. Jeff would have been in his mid-30s now, I guess.
Well, the killing was just a few months after Matthew Shepard was killed in Wyoming in the US, and both these hate crimes had quite a significant impact on a lot of people. One of the people it did have an impact on was Ronald Trefero Nelson, who was a local playwright. And in 2007, Ronald wrote the play Corner 4am and Cuba. And that was put on at Bats Theatre in Wellington. And Bats is it's about 100 seaters, so it's quite a small theatre, very intimate. And Ronald was telling us a few years ago that on opening night they had both Jeff's family and also the perpetrators' families in the audience, and just how dramatic that performance would have been in that evening. Very sad. Well, we've got one more stop before we end this tour, and that is a stop on Willow Street, and it's at St. Peter's Church. I've lost my Google map, so I'm just going to update the background here. So that's St. Peter's in the background on Willow Street.
Just here. So on this tour we've covered the Salvation Army's response to homosexual law reform and civil unions. And in 2012, the Army joined together with Rainbow Wellington to issue statements relating to homosexual law reform and its effects. Each statement was endorsed by both groups. So here are a couple of excerpts from the Salvation Army statement. They say, since the events of law reform in 1986, the Salvation Army has reflected deeply on its actions and the hurtful way some members publicly expressed their view on this legislative change. We regret and apologise for any hurt that may remain of the turbulent time, and our present hope is to rebuild bridges of understanding and dialogue between our movement and the GLBTI community. We may not agree in future on all issues, but we can respect and care for one another despite this. Well, the statement had a mixed reception, and one veteran activist stated that the Salvation Army needed to show some accountability for the gay lives that were lost to suicide during that time. So that's an apology, and I guess the next question is, how do you think the Army went on marriage equality? We've looked at civil unions and homosexual law reform. When the Marriage Equality Bill was going through Parliament in 2013, the Army made a submission to the Select Committee, and they said that they opposed the bill, but their submission only covered the need for reassurance that their marriage celebrants wouldn't be forced to marry same-sex couples. And I think that has come to pass, hasn't it, really? They don't have to. You don't have to marry anyone, to be honest, if you don't want to. And here we are at St. Peter's Anglican Church. Now, the Anglican Church still has some way to go to fully accepting gay marriage, or marriage equality, I should say. In May 2018, the Church voted in favour of allowing priests to bless same-sex marriages or civil unions, but not to carry out the actual ceremony within the Anglican Church.
But some parishes are a lot more supportive than others, and the one we're standing in front of,
This one's good.
St. Peter's, is good, and they have had a long history of being very supportive. In fact, it was in 1967 that the Reverend Godfrey Wilson, who was here at St. Peter's, did a nationwide broadcast of a sermon that was preaching tolerance and acceptance. And it was probably the first sermon of its type anywhere in New Zealand, and it was broadcast nationally. To give you an idea of what the kind of feeling was like in some quarters in 1967, we've got this newspaper article. This is actually from Christchurch, and it talks about the dangers of homosexuality, and Detective Superintendent F.A. Gordon, so if you like acronyms, that's FAG, asks the good people of Christchurch, do we want our cities overrun with pimps, ponces, pansies, pussyfoots and perverts? And
You put your comments in the comments
that's right.
section there, and
So that gives you a bit of an idea. I mean, this is like the state. This is like, you know, the police saying this. So even though they do say that it's his personal opinion, I mean, it's still
a little bit of prejudice going on there. I
Detective
think.
Sergeant. But anyway,
Anyway.
and of course, you know, homosexual law reform didn't happen in New Zealand until 1985, 1986. So the Reverend Godfrey Wilson was well ahead of his time when he was preaching tolerance. So the core of the sermon was about John, and John had been employed, but was now in prison because of his homosexuality. And John says to the chaplain, if you fall in love and marry, that's fine, but if I fall in love and want to share it, that's perversion and must be persecuted and punished. Well, in 2017, this service was reheld.
Repeated.
Repeated, yeah, to mark the 50th anniversary of Godfrey Wilson.
That original church service, yeah. This time, 50 years later, it was led by the Reverend Annette Cater, who at the end blesses the rainbow banners in the church, and which includes the one that she made from materials used for creating clergy vestments. And you can see some of the banners there in this image. This is from the inside of St. Peter's. Now, her blessing on that occasion was, we know that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in it. And God said, it is good, all of it. And so in that spirit, may these banners be a symbol of that all-encompassing, generous, amazing, unending love for all, that all who see it may be overwhelmed by the power of that love and know, God, that you are a God of love.
Lovely,
It was lovely, really.
And that's a really lovely way to end our walk tour today. Really hope you've enjoyed it. We've really enjoyed bringing it to you, and as I say, this is the first time we've done the Red tour as a virtual experience. I think we've experienced it quite well.
I thought it was pretty good, virtually speaking.
Yeah. So yeah, please feel free to join us for our next live broadcast, which is on Sunday the 2nd of January at 1 p.m. We really hope you can join us. But thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.
And we might see you a bit later on.
Ka kite.
Okay, bye.